Normandy, France, late July 1944. Morning haze lifts from the hedgerows, engines idle low, metal tracks ticking, canvas straps vibrating against hulls. Ahead, a sunken lane bends hard right, bordered by earth banks and thick bocage. American tanks nose forward one by one, antennae cutting faint arcs in the air. These are Shermans, but their turrets are different. Broader mantlets, longer barrels, counterweights at the muzzle. The new 76 60mm guns. A Panther waits beyond the bend, turret slewed, hull down behind a hedge stump. It has seen Shermans before and expects the usual: smoke, machine gun chatter, a 75mm round that won't bite from the front. The American lead tank throws smoke anyway. Infantry press the banks, a 50 cal hammers to keep heads low. Then the sound changes. A sharper report, flatter recoil, a faster tracer. The American gun finds a flank through the smoke gap and hedgerow seam. Impact. The German turret halts mid-traverse. The column does not pause. One tank pivots to cover, another crosses the lane, a third pushes through the hedge cut by engineers overnight. The field looks the same as yesterday. The terms of the fight no longer do. Before the hedgerows and their ambush angles, the Sherman's reputation was made on long approaches, open fields, and broken villages from Tunisia to the Liri Valley. In those earlier campaigns, the American problem was not hitting a single heavy tank on perfect ground. It was everything else: suppressing an anti-tank gun in a stone window, breaking a roadblock, cutting a machine gun nest out of a vineyard terrace, throwing smoke to move infantry across a street. For that work, the M4's short-barreled 75mm made sense. Its high-explosive shell was reliable, its fuses familiar, and its sight lines and turret layout were forgiving for rapidly changing targets. U.S. doctrine reflected this reality. Tanks were primarily for supporting the advance. Specialized tank destroyer units, sighted and maneuvered for ambush, would meet enemy armor. The war kept rewriting that script. From mid-1943 onward, reports from the Eastern Front and Italian hills filtered through. German armor was evolving quickly, and anti-tank defenses were deepening. The Panzer IV kept its bite with longer 75mm guns. Assault guns, Stuggy 3s and IVs, were cheap, low, and numerous. New vehicles called Panther and Tiger were appearing in growing numbers. American crews in Italy did not commonly duel Tigers frontally, but they learned how unforgiving German gunnery and optics could be, and how quickly a well-handled assault gun could kill from prepared cover. The Army's answer remained combined arms: artillery to dislocate, engineers to breach, infantry to clear, and tanks to move the line forward. Yet inside ordnance and the armored board, another answer gathered momentum: a refined gun for the same reliable chassis. The 76mm solution had been in development well before Normandy. The weapon, standardized as the 76mm M1, offered higher muzzle velocity and better armor-piercing performance than the 75mm, with ammunition families that could be improved further as manufacturing matured. The challenge was not simply a tube, it was the integration of gun, recoil system, equilibrators, and turret ergonomics with a turret drive and sighting package that crews could fight in quickly. The U.S. found that answer in a new turret lineage first proven on the experimental T-23 medium tank. The T-23 turret, adapted for the Sherman hull, provided the room and balance to mount the longer 76mm without unacceptable penalties to traverse or crew handling. Acceptance moved fast once the technical path was clear. By early 1944, the M4A1 76W cast-hull Sherman with wet ammunition stowage and the 76mm gun was standardized and entering production. Wet stowage was more than a letter suffix. Earlier, Shermans carried rounds in sponsons beside the hull. Penetrations there turned survivable hits into fatal fires. The redesigned system relocated ammunition into floor bins surrounded by water glycol jackets and added latches and shields to reduce the chance that a fragment could ignite propellant. Field and factory data would later show a marked drop in post-penetration burn rates, and with it, a subtle but real effect on crew confidence. Crew preference, however, was not automatic. Gunnery ranges in the United States revealed a trade-off. The 76 mm gave better armor penetration with the right shot and ammunition, but its standard high-explosive shell had less filler than the 75 mm HE. In the combined arms fight that American tankers expected, where knocking out a concealed anti-tank gun or blasting a farmhouse could be the task of the hour, many seasoned crews still favored the 75 mm. Muzzle blast from the 76 mm, especially in dry conditions, also kicked up dust that could momentarily obscure sights, a small but memorable irritant during training demonstrations. Doctrine and practice were tugging in opposite directions. Fight the battlefield you have, which demanded versatile HE, but prepare for the battlefield that might arrive, which might demand more punch against armor. While this debate played out, the enemy's force mix was shifting. German organizations leaned more heavily on assault guns and improved anti-tank guns to compensate for fewer tanks. When tanks did appear, Panthers were increasingly common in panzer divisions. Armor protection became less about raw thickness and more about geometry and slope, which magnified the advantage of velocity and pointed rounds when shots landed square and punished glancing hits. The 76 mm M1, on paper, offered a path to more reliable penetrations against Panzer IVs and assault guns at typical combat distances. Against a Panther's front hull, it was not a magic key. The problem there was angle and quality of plate, not simply inches. But the 76 mm increased the set of circumstances in which an American crew could force a solution through side shots, mantlet hits, or by exploiting combined arms tactics that created angles instead of trading frontal blows. Logistics and production set the tempo for everything that followed. The United States could not refit the entire force overnight, nor would it halt delivery of 75 mm Shermans that commanders still valued for their HE work. The reality of spring 1944 was a mix: training units receiving new 76 mm tanks, depots building spares pipelines, ammunition plants ramping up variety, and crews learning a slightly different sight picture and recoil impulse. The plan for the Normandy assault itself didn't hinge on the 76 mm. Landing tables were frozen, shipping space was rationed to the bolt, and the tanks that went ashore on the 6th June were overwhelmingly 75 mm models, vehicles that planners trusted to support infantry under fire, breach beach obstacles, and survive in a kill zone dominated by mines and guns rather than enemy armor. Yet the war in France would not remain a problem of beaches and bunkers. Once the hedgerow puzzle was solved and the breakout began, German armor and assault guns would reappear in numbers and at speed. The Americans would need He to clear the way, and a sharper tool for the moments when a moving engagement offered a fleeting side shot or a chance to punish a German counterattack. That convergence of need and capability is what the summer of 1944 would test next, and it is where the 76 mm Sherman would step from planning documents into the dust and heat of Normandy's lanes. The Overlord assault force went ashore with what planners trusted, mostly 75 mm armed Shermans supported by engineers, naval guns, and an air armada. The landing tables were fixed months in advance. Shipping space was fought over, bolt by bolt. A new gun that was still maturing in supply and training cycles would not decide 6th June. Beaches and bunkers would. In June, the 76 mm existed largely on paper schedules and stateside ranges. Normandy made its own demands. The bocage was a fortress built by centuries of farming, earthen banks, interlocked routes, visibility that collapsed to a few dozen yards, then to nothing at the next bend. German anti-tank guns and assault guns sat behind narrow gaps and pre-sighted lanes covered by machine guns and mortars. American infantry and tankers learned fast. Engineers cut lanes. Crews improvised hedgerow rhinoceros cutters from scrap steel. Platoons practiced coordinated bursts of smoke, short dashes, immediate suppression with 30s and 50s, and a drill that put a tank's gun across every likely hole in the hedge before the hull moved again. By July, the campaign's character shifted. The point was no longer to claw another orchard. It was to break the German line in depth and turn the fight into open ground. That is what Operation Cobra sought at the end of the month: saturating bombardment, shock, then a violent push through an enemy stunned and dislocated. In these conditions, the new Shermans began to appear, first in limited numbers, then in growing ones. Their longer barrels looked out of place in hedged lanes built for ox carts, but the reason for them would reveal itself once the lanes opened onto fields and road nets. American crews noticed the trade-offs at once. The 76 mm armor-piercing performance was better, especially against Panzer IVs and the many Stugge assault guns anchoring German defenses. Its tracer was flatter, its strike felt cleaner on a good hit. But the standard high-explosive shell carried less filler than the familiar 75 mm round. Against a stubborn farmstead or an anti-tank gun blinking through a window slit, crews sometimes still wanted the 75. In hedgerow duels where one quick HE round could erase an ambush, that preference made sense. In a breakout where German armor might counterattack across hedgeless stubble or along a hedgerow's outside face, the 76 mm's reach mattered more. German formations presented a hard mix. Many divisions were rebuilt on the move, with battalions of Panthers and Panzer IVs alongside towed 75 mm anti-tank guns and plentiful assault guns that hid low and struck first. A Panther's frontal glacis remained a bitter problem. Angle and plate quality did the defending. Yet the world was three-dimensional. The 76 mm opened more paths to a solution: turret mantlet strikes, side shots forced by smoke and flanking, and repeated engagements where American units, fed by radios, artillery on call, and air cover, could choose angles rather than accept them. Logistics controlled the ceiling of performance. Ammunition families expanded as the months passed. The kinetic answer round, the hypervelocity armor-piercing type, appeared only in limited quantities at first. When it was present at the point of contact, it could change a duel. When it was not, crews fell back on standard cap shot and tactics they could execute reliably under fire. Wet ammunition stowage worked invisibly, reducing the likelihood that a penetrating hit would be followed by fire. That did not turn the Sherman into a tank that shrugged off punishment. It made crews more likely to fight the next engagement. Doctrine bent to the battlefield. Pre-war and early war ideas had assigned tank-on-tank battle to dedicated tank destroyer units. Normandy did not always allow that neat separation. In the bocage and the breakout that followed, whoever was on scene first fought first. That often meant tank companies absorbing the opening shock, then folding in tank destroyers, artillery, and fighter bombers as the combined arms machines spun up. The 76 mm fit this reality. It did not replace artillery or air power. It complemented them, giving the lead platoon a more decisive tool when a fleeting side shot appeared at 400 yards, or when an assault gun showed too much of its casemate while shifting positions. There was no single day when the new gun arrived. There was a sequence, a handful of platoons receiving M4A1 76 W tanks in late July. Commanders deciding where to place them, crews learning how the longer tube changed balance and lay, mechanics sorting the spares that were not yet routine. Reports went up and came down. Some officers preferred the 75 mm for the daily grind of clearing. Others argued that the 76 mm advantages in open fighting would matter once the line broke. Both were right in the terrain they faced. The Army solved the argument pragmatically by fielding both and letting operations dictate which tool mattered today. The German reaction followed the contour of contact. Early contempt rested on real experiences. Shermans burning after side penetrations, 75mm rounds glancing from sloped armor. American units hesitating in hedges, packed with traps. As the breakout accelerated, contempt gave way to caution. The same Shermans were now flanking with infantry, riding the decks, covered by fighter bombers and artillery that landed on time. The longer guns on certain turrets, combined with the tempo that American logistics enforced, meant that a German counterattack might be blunted by fire from directions it had not yet faced. A tank that could be replaced within days was a different strategic fact than a tank that took weeks to reconstitute. By the time the Allies crossed the Seine and drove toward the German frontier, the shape of the armor fight was clearer. The 76mm did not make frontal shots easy against the heaviest enemy plate. It made more shots meaningful when the Americans created the right conditions. Those conditions were the real American weapon: radios on every vehicle, disciplined smoke, aggressive flanking, artillery schedules that stacked on command, and the industrial depth to keep the machine supplied. The gun on the turret was the visible sign of a larger change, one that would become more pronounced as autumn approached. With that shift in view, we can examine the subject from several angles. The ballistics and ammunition families that defined what the 76mm could do. The survivability improvements that kept crews in the fight. The tactics that made the gun decisive. The production and leadership decisions that scaled it. And the enemy's evolving response to all of it. Ballistics and ammunition. The 76mm M1 brought speed. Higher muzzle velocity meant a flatter trajectory, less lead error, and more remaining energy at the ranges, where most tank fights actually happened in Western Europe, hundreds of meters, not kilometers. With the standard armor-piercing capped shot, APC/APCBC, American crews could defeat Panzerabwehr and most assault guns from tactically useful angles and distances. The geometry of enemy armor mattered as much as thickness. Sloped plate turned marginal hits into ricochets. Square-on impacts turned calculations back in the gunner's favor. Against a Panther's frontal glacis, even the 76mm rarely offered a clean answer. Side plates and turret features were the practical aim points. That is why training and briefings emphasized where to look: sprockets, lower side hull, turret ring, mantlet edges, places where steel and shape conceded an opening. Ammunition variation sharpened those openings. Crews learned to distinguish what was on hand and in the ready rack. APC for general use, the improved capped shot when available, and in limited quantities, HVAP, the hypervelocity round, whose dense core and very high speed gave the 76mm a dramatic, though scarce, boost against heavier targets. When an HVAP strike landed cleanly on a Panther side at common combat ranges, the results were decisive. When HVAP was missing, tactics had to create the same effect by maneuver. The trade-off was real at the other end of the spectrum. The 76mm standard HE carried less filler than the 75mm trusted shell, which meant fewer walls collapsing with a single shot. The gun's value therefore rose with the platoon's ability to pick armor targets, while mortars and artillery shouldered more of the heavy HE work. Survivability and crew confidence. The Sherman's reputation for burning was earned in 1942-43 when ammunition lived in dry sponsons along the hull sides. Penetrations there often turned survivable hits into fires. The W in the new design denoted wet stowage, sealed floor bins surrounded by water glycol jackets with better latches and shielding. The change did not make a Sherman invulnerable. It made the path from penetration to fire far less likely. That statistical shift had a human effect. Crews who believed that a hit did not automatically mean flame were more willing to stay in the fight, keep the gun laid, and finish a drill under pressure. The T-23 line turret that housed the 76 mm also mattered. Balance, power traverse, and room for the loader gave seconds back to the crew, seconds that decided whether a follow-up shot arrived before the enemy could traverse, back, or smoke off. Radios were standard. Intercom discipline kept orders crisp inside the tank, while net discipline kept platoons coordinated. In practice, survivability was not simply protection. It was the sum of more stable stowage, a turret that didn't fight its own crew, a gun that could stay on target through recoil, and a command net that let a platoon shift fires or bound without confusion. There were downsides to manage. The 76 mm blast could kick dust that momentarily obscured sights on dry ground. Gunners compensated with shorter pauses between shots and small corrections in lay. The longer tube added length in tight lanes, increasing the chance of snagging hedges or walls. Drivers and tank commanders adapted spacing and speeds. None of these quirks canceled the core benefit. A crew that trusted its machine to keep working after the first surprise was a crew ready to create the second surprise for the enemy. Tactics that unlocked the 76 mm. The gun's numbers were only as good as the angles a platoon could earn. American combined arms were built to manufacture those angles. Smoke grenades and smoke shells cut sight lines at the key moment. Artillery time-on-target concentrations shocked German batteries and pinned Overwatch. Engineers opened unexpected gaps. Infantry marked ambush windows with tracers and hand signals, and the tanks themselves used bounding movement to trade risk between lead and supporting elements. Within that choreography, the 76 mm gave the lead tank more reach and better chance at a killing side shot when a German vehicle presented a profile crossing a lane, shifting position, or pivoting to meet a threat. Air power translated planning into momentum. Fighter bombers did not erase German armor. They fragmented countermoves and forced dispersal, making coordinated thrusts less likely. That bought time for tank companies and tank destroyers to set up the fight they wanted. When contact came, a practice drill took over. Frontal vehicles suppressed with machine guns and smoke. One element fixed the enemy, another pressed for the edge of cover to put the 76 mm on a side plate. Communications kept the pressure coherent. A commander could call for a quick-fire mission to blind the enemy hedge, then push 2 guns across the seam while a third held the lane. Aerocourt offered the textbook case: fog, fields, dispersed fights, and American units, turning fleeting sightings into flanking fires. There, the 76 mm advantages, stacked with everything else, radios, artillery on call, experienced NCOs, to punish German thrusts that arrived piecemeal. The lesson repeated through the autumn. The 76 mm did not change physics, but it changed probabilities when the Americans controlled tempo. Create uncertainty with smoke and suppression, decide where the next shot will be taken, and let a sharper gun convert that decision into a hole in the right plate. With the mechanics of firepower, protection, and tactics in view, the larger machine that scaled those advantages, production and leadership, comes into focus next. Production and fielding scale turned theory into fact. The first 76 mm armed Shermans to reach U.S. units in Northwest Europe were M4A176W cast hulls mated to the T-23 line turret with wet ammunition stowage as standard. Through late summer and autumn 1944, deliveries broadened to the preferred M4A376W, whose Ford GAA engine simplified maintenance and parts across many U.S. battalions. Depots learned fast. New turrets meant different spares. Recoil cylinders, equilibrators, and sight components had to be on the shelf, not on a ship. Recovery vehicles and engine teams kept the tempo up. A tank hauled in at dusk might be back in line the next afternoon if the damage was within the depot's reach. Ammunition lagged behind hulls. Standard armor piercing and high explosive were abundant. The scarce item was HVEP, the tungsten core answer round that made the 76 mm bite harder against heavy armor. Priority often went to units expected to meet counterattacks or to formations covering likely avenues of approach. When allocations arrived, commanders treated them as a reserve, handed out to gunners who would only load them when a real heavy presented a real side. Ride quality mattered more than brochures suggested. The HVSS suspension and wider tracks of the EZ-8 arrived in combat by late 1944, smoothing gun laying on the move and spreading ground pressure in winter fields. It did not change the Sherman silhouette. It changed how quickly a crew could stop, settle, and put a first round where it counted. By winter, companies often fielded a mix: veteran 75mm tanks for heavy HE chores, 76mm tanks for armor fights, and a few HVSS machines that everyone wanted to drive. The combination reflected an army that solved problems in layers rather than with one perfect vehicle. Leadership and doctrine. The 76mm story was also a command story. Early U.S. guerrilla doctrine kept tank versus tank battle as the tank destroyer's job. Normandy broke that neat division. Whoever was on the ground first met the first thrust. Field commanders adapted without ceremony. If a tank company had the angle, the tank company took the shot. If tank destroyers arrived with better fields of fire, they took over. The doctrine bent to contact. Higher headquarters pushed from another direction. Armored Board and Ordnance had argued for the 76mm well before D-Day. Army ground forces preferred the 75mm HE for the tasks most crews actually faced. Combat reconciled the argument. Reports from Cobra, Aracourt, and the Ardennes convinced theater leadership that more 76mm guns and better ammunition were needed forward. By early 1945, guidance from the top prioritized sending 76mm Shermans to the European theater and accelerating shipments of HVAP where possible. Personalities colored the margins. Some senior officers valued the 75mm HE above all. Others stressed that the battlefield was wide and that a platoon needed both tools. Division and battalion commanders made the practical choices. Mix platoons deliberately, pair 75s with 76s, and ensure that when a German thrust appeared out of fog or across a hedge line, at least one gun in the lead element could make the shot. The result was not a revolution, but a ratchet. Each month of combat hardened the case for more 76mm tanks in frontline companies without abandoning the 75mm utility in towns, woods, and fortified farms. Leadership did not chase a poster solution. It matched weapons to the war it had and the war it expected to face tomorrow. Enemy POV German crews met the Sherman 76 the way they met the rest of the American machine, with assumptions formed at Kasserine and the Liri Valley, and with realities set by 1944 France. At short notice, they rebuilt divisions with Panthers, Panzerfoes, and a backbone of assault guns, and towed 75mm anti-tank guns. Early contempt drew on memory, Shermans burning from side hits, 75mm rounds failing on sloped plate. Then the pattern shifted. Counterattacks ran into smoke, artillery that arrived together, and tank platoons whose longer guns punished a moment's exposure at 400 yards. The 76mm did not erase the Panthers' frontal strength. It erased the expectation that a Sherman platoon lacked an answer once angles could be forced. Reports complained about American radios and tempo. Enemy tanks appeared on the flank faster than they should. Smoke closed lanes just as guns were laid. Another platoon entered the fight as soon as the first fell back to reload. When HVAP was present at the point of contact, crews who had laughed at Tommy cookers learned caution. Side armor became a liability, not a refuge. When HVAP was absent, the Americans still made the geometry, using machine guns to pin, smoke to blind, and the 76mm to punish the first mistake. Fuel and air compounded the German problem. Shortages limited training and maneuver. Fighter bombers forced dispersion. Artillery pounded assembly areas before a coordinated push could form. From that vantage, the enemy's view of the 76 millimeters was not awe at a single weapon. It was respect for a system that put a sharper gun into a faster, better supported fight, and made yesterday's assumptions unsafe. The pieces are in place: a sharper gun, crews that trust their machines, tactics that make angles, a supply chain that keeps momentum, and an enemy forced to react. What remains is the moment when these strands tighten into decision on the battlefield itself. The breakout did not begin with a duel. It began with pressure and dislocation. Operation Cobra, late July 1944. Heavy bombers hammer a narrow front west of St. Lo, then fighter bombers rake the roads. Dust and smoke roll low across hedgerows. German formations that had spent weeks trading short-range fire in lanes now find their telephone lines cut, command posts shaken, and reserves pinned under bombardment. When the ground attack jumps off, the fight is no longer orchard by orchard, it is depth. American infantry move first, peeling back the immediate crust of resistance. Then armor flows into the breaches. Among the columns are the new long-barreled M4A1 76W, still a minority, easy to spot by the longer tube and counterweight. Company commanders seed them into the lead platoons. The instruction is simple: keep the pace, and when armor appears, make the angle and take the shot. The first engagements look familiar. A German Pak-40 behind a hedge. A Stu G3 shifting position along a lateral lane. The American drill, smoke, suppression, bound, remains the same, but the outcome changes at the edges. Where a 75 millimeter round might have forced the assault gun to button up and withdraw, the 76 millimeter converts a moment of exposure into a decisive hit at ranges where the platoon can stay in motion. Gunners notice the flatter trajectory. Loaders manage the heavier rounds without complaint. Dust from the muzzle blast hangs when the ground is dry, but the power traverse finds lay again quickly, and second shots arrive before the enemy can relocate. German armored counterthrusts gather through the afternoon as staffs try to restore a line. Panzer IVs come first, appearing in 2s and 3s at the corners of fields, using hedges as partial cover. Frontal trades still punish carelessness. The Americans do not offer them. Platoon leaders cut sight lines with smoke, hold one element on the hedge, and push another to an elbow where a side plate will appear. The 76 millimeters does not remove the need for geometry. It rewards it. On a clean side, the APC round breaks through and stops the counterthrust before it can spread. The tempo is the larger weapon. Artillery answers in minutes, sometimes seconds, to requests that blind a suspected lane or rip a suspected regrouping point. P-47s prowl above the breakout corridor, their presence enough to scatter movement in daylight. Radios fill the gaps between drills. A tank commander calls a short, precise fire mission to screen a bend. Another reports a possible Panther track on the road ahead. A company net passes word that assault guns have been seen shifting left. The columns keep moving, and with every kilometer, the battlefield becomes worse for the defender. Where Panthers do appear, they arrive as parts of a damaged plan, single vehicles pushing forward to restore control of a crossroads, or small groups probing for the edge of the breach. The frontal hull remains a wall the Americans do not waste shots upon. Instead, infantry mark a flank with tracers. An engineer section points to a gap cut the night before. A Sherman with a 76 mm noses through the seam with a mate covering. Smoke blooms on the Panther's right to hold its gun. The American gunner watches for the pause in traverse that betrays the driver's decision, then sends the first round into the visible side. A second shot follows before dust can occlude the sight. The Panther's threat was real. Its options were not. Road nets become battles of momentum. West of the breach, German columns, motorized infantry, guns, service echelons try to move through bottlenecks to form a new line. American armor, much of it still 75 mm, strikes at the edges. breaking convoys and forcing dispersal. The 76mm tanks at the point play a specific role in this chaos. They turn intermittent armor sightings into kills faster. A Panzer IV that might have slipped across a cut lane under smoke takes a hit while still committed to the crossing. A Stug that reveals its casemate to angle for a better shot receives an APC strike through the side before it can complete the pivot. In the first 48 hours of Cobra, the evidence accumulates in small reports and unit logs rather than in a single poster moment. A platoon leader notes that the long-barreled tanks finished exposed assault guns at ranges where the 75mm often forced withdrawals. A battalion diary remarks that crews prefer the 75 for houses, but will not trade away the 76 when contact is lively. Recovery sections record that knocked out Shermans with wet stowage burn less often, making salvage and return to service more likely. None of this is dramatic in isolation. Together, it is a shift. The Ronsi area becomes a study in compounded pressure. As German forces attempt to withdraw and regroup along jammed lanes, American fighter bombers smash columns, artillery traps intersections, and armored elements cut in from angles that the maps do not warn about. The long-barreled Shermans move with their companies, not as a separate shock force, but as sharper tools inside the existing drill. When a German tank appears at the edge of a hedgerow, the decision time compresses. The 76mm buys seconds back for the Americans, and those seconds stack across a day. Command decisions harden as the breakout widens. Corps and division staffs, reading the traffic from the regiments, begin to prioritize the new guns for units that will hold the shoulders of the penetration or spearhead the exploitation south toward Coutances and beyond. Ammunition officers push limited stocks of HVAP forward with clear instructions. Do not waste it. Load it only when a heavy target shows a side. In practice, most kills still come from standard shot applied with better angles. HVAP is a trump that appears rarely and matters when it does. German reports register the change from their end of the fight. Units describe heavy smoke, rapid movement, and tanks with longer guns engaging from unexpected directions. Assault guns complain that positions once safe between hedges now draw flanking fire within minutes. A Panther company notes that a counterattack lost coherence when artillery obscured the start line and tanks appeared on the right before the formation could complete its first bound. None of these sentences mention the 76mm by designation. They describe its effect inside a system that multiplies it. By the time 7 Corps pushes through the broken crust and open country returns, the experiment has a field result. The 76mm does not eliminate the Panther's frontal invulnerability or make town fighting easier. It makes American platoons more dangerous in the moving fights that now dominate. The gun slots into a choreography, engineers, infantry, artillery, air that gives it the chances it needs. And where chances are made, the outcomes change. Counterattacks stall faster, crossings are cut sooner, and the breakout's pace becomes harder to arrest. What follows is the consolidation of these lessons through the autumn's battles, fogged fields, dispersed armor actions, and a high command that turns field reports into policy. The lessons of the breakout matured in autumn. Fog returned, fields widened, the fight moved from hedge corridors to rolling ground and villages rimmed by orchards. Here, the new balance inside American tank companies, still many 75mm Shermans, an increasing share of 76mm guns, was tested against German armor coming forward to restore coherence. Ericourt, September 1944. In Lorraine, German armored brigades, reconstituted fast, mixing Panthers, Panzer IVs, and assault guns, pushed against U.S. formations scattered by rapid advances and a supply line stretched thin. The terrain broke into folds and patches of visibility. Dawn brought mist that swallowed silhouettes and shortened decisions to seconds. American tankers and tank destroyer crews built the day on drills they already trusted: hold, blind, flank, strike. A 76mm Sherman in the lead platoon was a quiet advantage, not a banner. It meant that when a Panther appeared broadside through thinning fog, the first clean shot could become a kill at the ranges these fights demanded. It meant that a Panzer IV, cresting into view, could be punished before it slid back behind the ridge. The heavier HE of the 75mm still knocked apart strong points and windows. Artillery still wrote the margins with timed concentrations. But the 76mm sharpened the opening minutes, turning sightings into losses the enemy could feel. The pattern repeated across the days. German thrusts arrived in packets, hampered by fuel, ad hoc control, and the terrain's funnels. American radios aligned platoons that had started the morning beyond sight of each other. One element fixed the thrust with smoke and suppressive fire. Another shifted to the angle the map suggested, and the mist concealed. When the turn came, the moment a German driver committed to cross a shallow saddle or a lane, 76mm APC struck home. Where HVF was on hand, a Panther caught in profile lost its claim to impunity. Where HVF was absent, the answer came from repetition: keep the angle, keep the net calm, and knock out the vehicles that showed sides under pressure. By nightfall after nightfall, the German account grew. Panthers abandoned or burning, assault guns found in ditches where fog became trap, counterattacks bled into defensive scrapes. The effect moved upward. Battalion and combat command journals noted that mixed gun platoons worked: 75mm for the heavy HE chores, 76mm for the armor problem when it appeared suddenly at 300-600 yards. Ammunition officers pushed scarce HVAP forward to companies likely to meet armor the next morning. Recovery sections logged fewer burned-out wrecks among wet stowage Shermans, a statistic that translated into patched tanks reappearing in line 2 days later. Nothing in these pages claimed a miracle. They recorded a ratchet clicking forward. Winter forced a harsher test. The Ardennes, December 1944. Weather grounded the air umbrella that had shadowed the advance since Normandy. German armor came in mass and in cold, seeking a rupture that could be widened before skies cleared. American units, surprised and displaced, fell back, held key towns, and formed new lines under pressure. The first days belonged to concealment and audacity. Here, the 76mm's value was compressed into narrow windows, a roadblock at the mouth of a wood where a Panzer IV nosed forward too far, a tree-line skirmish at 400 yards where a Panther's turret crossed a gap, an ambush set with a single lane of fire. In those seconds, a sharper gun bought probability. When M4A3 76, UHVSS. Easy 8 tanks entered the fight in growing numbers, wider tracks, a steadier ride, quicker settlement after a halt. The platoon's first round came sooner and with less correction. The change did not alter armor mathematics against a Panther's nose. It altered how fast American crews could seize the one chance that mattered. Command attention focused. Field reports, fog fights won by angles, towns held by mixed companies, armor halted where the first seconds were decisive, landed on desks where theater priorities were written. Requests moved as orders. Accelerate the flow of 76mm Shermans to Europe, push HVAP forward whenever stocks allowed. Continue issuing 75mm tanks where their HE utility remained critical, but do not let the armored spearhead lack the longer gun. In the same currents, a small number of heavier tanks joined the theater, M26s that would matter at set-piece points in early 1945. But the daily armor war still fell largely to Shermans, now increasingly with 76mm barrels. As snow crusted into ruts and the German attack spent itself, the American answer hardened into pace. Relief columns punched through to towns under siege. Roads reopened under artillery schedules as deliberate as clockwork. Armor spread into the clearings, then onto the hard shoulders where trees met fields. Easy 8s showed their worth in these transitions. Tracks floated better on winter ground. Crews felt less bounce under braking and less wander over rutted verges. A stabilized firing platform remained a post-war promise. A steadier one existed now. When a thrust appeared at the edge of a clearing, the 76 mm could be laid and fired without the extra seconds a rougher ride demanded. German accounts across the winter and into spring adjusted their tone. Tank companies that had expected to dominate local fights with frontal strength wrote about being forced to blind themselves with smoke or rotate hulls under fire to meet threats that arrived from oblique angles. Assault gun battalions complained that positions safe in October were untenable in January. American tanks and destroyers did not stay long in any one field of view, and when they reappeared, it was at a slant that made casemate armor a liability. Commanders pointed to American logistics as a weapon. Tanks replaced, crews rotated, ammunition types appearing where doctrine predicted decisive contact. The 76 mm was a line item in that larger arithmetic, but a line item that changed inputs at the point of contact. By early 1945, with the Rhine not yet crossed, but the initiative firmly back in Allied hands, theater guidance codified 6 months of practice. Frontline companies would be weighted towards 76 mm tanks. Allocations of HVAP would be focused on units meeting armor in open country. HVSS vehicles would be concentrated where mobility and quick first-round accuracy paid dividends across thawing ground. The 75 mm remained invaluable for urban fights and close terrain. It was not discarded. It was paired deliberately with platoon mates that could turn a fleeting armor sighting into a kill. The last weeks of winter fed the ledger. In river approaches, on rising ground before crossings, along roads running to towns the maps marked in thick type, the same sequence returned: smoke to cut sight lines, artillery to shake assembly areas, movement to take the edge, a 76 mm to finish the exposure. Where German crews once took for granted that a Sherman platoon could be fixed and reduced by frontal fight, caution replaced contempt. Pause before crossing a gap. Check the flank before shifting the hull. Expect a second platoon to appear where the first had fallen back. Expect the longer barrel. The turning point then was not a single duel filmed from a bell tower. It was a season of fights in which the 76 mm made American choices more damaging and German mistakes more costly, especially when air returned and the full choreography, artillery, engineers, infantry, armor, played at tempo. By the time the rivers fell and the crossings widened into bridgeheads, the enemy's assumptions had been altered. The Americans did not just have more tanks, they had more answers inside the same minute of contact. The consequences of those months, numbers, losses, directives, and the shape of late war confidence belong to the aftermath. The first reckoning came on paper. Staffs compared reports from July through winter, contact ranges, engagement outcomes, recovery tallies, and ammunition consumption. Patterns were clear. When American companies could dictate angle and range, platoons with a higher share of 76 mm guns ended fights faster against Panzer IVs and Stu Guis, and they converted fleeting side shots on Panthers more often. In towns and woods, the 75 mm still did heavy lifting with high explosive, but even there commanders liked a 76 in the lead section. Insurance for the moment, an assault gun showed too much profile. Supply maps changed. Depots in Normandy had treated 76 mm turrets as new work. By autumn, recoil parts, equilibrators, and sight units sat on shelves as routine stock. Ammunition tables shifted too. Standard APC and HE were plentiful. The signal line, written in pencil and underlined, was HVAP. It remained scarce, but it moved forward with intent. Companies guarding likely counterattack corridors received a box or two, often held by the company commander, and issued with a short briefing. Load only when it matters. Call it out. Crews learned to fight on APC for most work and treat HVAP like a promise. Recovery logs told a quieter story. Wet stowage Shermans burned less often after penetration. Wrecking cranes brought in more vehicles that could be patched. A hole in a bin lid, spall marks on a turret wall, a seared radio, but hulls that would roll again. The statistic translated into days saved, and crews kept together. Confidence followed the numbers. Tank commanders were less likely to bail at the first jolt. Loaders stayed on the ready rack. Gunners rode the sight through recoil, expecting to fire again. Battalion diaries recorded the field verdict. Mixed platoons worked. 2 or 3 76mm guns up front, a couple of 75s close behind, and attached tank destroyers positioned for the longer lanes. This became the practical template. The HVSS Easy 8 entered those mixes through winter. Crews noticed the difference first in their hands and backs. Steadier lay after braking, fewer corrections before the first shot, better footing on frozen ruts and thawing verges. The silhouette had not changed, but the time between halt and accurate fire had shortened, and that time was often the fight. Enemy reactions entered intelligence summaries almost word for word from captured reports. Panthers were told to avoid exposing sides across open gaps. Assault guns were warned that positions safe in October were unsafe in January if Americans could flank within minutes. Commanders complained about radios they could not jam and artillery schedules that cut assembly areas before counterattacks could form. No one sentence credited an American gun by model. The impression was systemic. Longer-barreled Shermans appearing where they had no right to, firing sooner than expected, and fighting inside a combined arms net that made every exposure riskier. Theaters codified what the front had learned. By early 1945, allocations favored M4A3 76, W for units expected to meet armor in open country, while 75mm Shermans continued to fill urban and close-terrain roles. Ammunition officers were directed to concentrate HVAP where armor duels were probable and to track its use. Training circulars emphasized target anatomy, turret edges, mantlet seams, lower side hulls, and reminded crews that smoke and movement created the shots the 76mm could finish. Engineers refined hedge and wall breaching drills to ensure that longer barrels did not telegraph a crest or snag a lane. Aracort's ledger became a teaching point. Fog, dispersed fights, and disciplined nets had let American armor cut apart larger German thrusts that arrived in packets. The presence of 76mm guns had turned first sightings into losses the enemy could not ignore. After-action talks used those days to illustrate doctrine. Fix, blind, angle, strike, repeat until the counterattack bleeds out. The Ardennes reinforced the lesson under harder conditions. When air was grounded and the enemy pressed in mass, ambush geometry and quick first rounds mattered more. The Easy 8 showed practical gains in that narrow window, not by altering armor mathematics, but by shaving seconds off the moment that decided if an opportunity became a kill. Numbers helped freeze the picture. By late 1944, a visible minority of U.S. Shermans in Northwest Europe carried the 76mm. By spring 1945, frontline companies often leaned toward them, with 75s retained for tasks where volume, and fragmentation were decisive. Replacement flow, not unit preference alone, governed the exact mix. What mattered was that the European theater could now ask for the longer gun, and more often than not, receive it in time to influence the next operation. The human tone shifted as well. Crews described the 76mm not as a miracle, but as a relief, an answer they could trust when a Panther drifted into view at a slant or a Panzer IV flashed across a gap. Infantry who had ridden decks since Normandy noticed that armor fights around them ended sooner, with less need to wait under mortar fire for a tank destroyer to arrive. Artillery observers, already accustomed to calling smoke like a carpenter swings a hammer, folded the 76 millimeters into their mental plan. Blind here, nudge there, and let the point platoon finish what the barrage began. None of this unmade the enemy's strengths. German optics remained crisp. Their gunnery was lethal when they owned the angles and the first shot. But the margin of surprise had narrowed. Radios in every vehicle, wet stowage that kept crews in the fight, HVSS that steadied the lay, and a gun that punished exposure. Together, they made counterattacks costlier and repositioning more dangerous. With the operational balance altered, the final months would show how those accumulations translated into strategy. Where the 76 mm sat inside the push to the rivers, how directives hardened into procurement priorities, and why late war confidence looked different inside American armored battalions. The altered balance in company lineups, more 76 mm guns up front, mixed with 75s for heavy HE tasks, fed upward into operational design. Corps plans in early 1945 assumed that tank battalions could meet enemy armor without waiting for tank destroyers to arrive from depth. That assumption mattered in river approaches, road centers, and the edges of bridgeheads, where minutes decided whether a crossing widened or stalled. When staffs drew the arcs of likely German counterattacks, they placed 76 mm platoons at the shoulders, wrote smoke and artillery timings into the hour, and noted where limited HVF could be cached to meet a heavy threat from an angle. Procurement reflected the same calculus. The European theater requested and received greater proportions of M4A3 76W, with HVSS concentrated where ground and tempo would reward it most. Depots tuned their rhythm. T-23 line turret spares forward, recoil and equilibrator parts stocked in quantity. Sights and traverse motors checked on a cycle that made failures rare in contact. Recovery and rebuild capacity became an invisible weapon. A tank holed through a side bin might be back with a new lid, resealed jackets, and a fresh radio by the end of the week. A platoon that lost 2 vehicles on Friday could count on one or both returning before the next push. That continuity preserved crew chemistry, another intangible that paid off in the first awkward seconds of an engagement. Strategically, the pattern compressed German choices. On the approach to major rivers, American armor no longer ceded initiative when Panthers appeared at a slant. Smoke-blinded lanes, artillery-cut assembly woods. When the moment came, 76 mm platoons shot into a geometry they had drawn themselves. German commanders were forced into smoke and withdraw drills sooner and more often, with fewer chances to build a coherent thrust. Assault gun battalions, which had banked on killing from prepared cover, discovered that cover would be flanked in minutes, not hours. Each forced displacement burned fuel, consumed time, and added to the friction already eating their orders. At the battalion level, training caught up with reality. Gunnery tables now emphasized target anatomy in detail, not as a rote diagram, but as a practical checklist. Mantelet cheeks at medium range, the lower side hull when a vehicle angled, turret ring rakes if a shot at the side was fleeting, track and sprocket strikes if time allowed only one meaningful round before the enemy reversed. Tactical rehearsals drilled blind fix flank strike as muscle memory. Infantry practiced deck riding and rapid dismounts for an immediate flank push, then remounts once the first armor threat was cleared. Engineers refined gap cutting for longer tubes so that a 76's barrel wouldn't snag and telegraph a crest. The enemy's reaction flowed into intelligence digests. Panther companies recorded that counterattacks bled cohesion under American smoke and quick flanking movement. Vehicles knocked out from the side outnumbered frontal kills by a wide margin. Assault gun units reported that their old sweet spots between hedges or at village edges were discovered and raked sooner, often by tanks that had not been visible 5 minutes earlier. A recurring observation surfaced. American tanks fired more quickly after halting. a field way of describing HVSS ride benefits and well-drilled crews. None of these notes were dramatic alone. Together, they described a shrinking window in which German armor could act without immediate, punishing response. The late war appearance of heavier U.S. tanks added a separate line to the ledger without replacing the main one. A limited number of new heavies entered combat in early 1945, addressing specific tactical problems and easing the psychological burden on units facing Panthers in set-piece fights. But most daily armor work still fell to Shermans, now dominated by 76mm guns in formations expected to meet armor. In that reality, the 76mm impact was not the vanquishing of a single enemy type. It was the erosion of the enemy's confidence that angles could be held and seconds owned. Crossings and pursuits pushed the lesson across rivers and into Germany's interior. In-town approaches, 75mm tanks continued to level walls and suppress nests with big HE. Once a lane cleared, a 76mm platoon slipped to the fore for the moment when an assault gun tried to break the rhythm from a side street. On ridge approaches, artillery set the stage. When smoke thinned and a Panther nosed across, the sharper gun punished exposure if a flank showed. Even where weather-grounded fighters and mud-slowed convoys, the internal cycle, recover, repair, rotate crews, resupply the few cases of HVAP, held together well enough that the company's character remained constant. The statistical picture by spring captured what the battlefield had already taught. The share of 76mm tanks in frontline companies had grown markedly since summer. Wet stowage and better crew procedures reduced post-penetration fires. HVSS improved first-round speed and consistency. HVAP remained scarce but meaningful where commanders managed it as a local reserve. The enemy had not been outthought solely by a new gun. It had been outpaced and outangled by a force that layered small advantages until they produced decisive effects. Psychology followed strategy. American platoon leaders wrote with a steadier hand about meeting German armor. The tone shifted from "wait for destroyers" to "we can handle the first minutes." Infantry captains described less time pinned under mortar fire while armor solved a local tank threat. German statements captured after actions moved from contempt to caution, and finally to a grim acknowledgment that American tanks would likely reappear at the one place where a side plate could not be protected for long. By the time operations widened into the final pushes of 1945, confidence, grounded, not boastful, had settled into American armor units. The 76mm had not transformed the Sherman into a different machine. It had aligned the tank with the war the Americans were actually fighting, a war of flanks earned by smoke and movement, of radios compressing decision cycles, of recovery and replacement turning losses into pauses instead of gaps. And that alignment prepared the ground for the last question any battlefield asks. What, beyond the numbers and the reports, does this change mean for how soldiers remember, how institutions learn, and how wars are decided at human scale? That is the work of reflection. In the end, the 76mm gun did not change what war asks of men. It changed what they could answer with in the minute that mattered. The crews who lived inside the Sherman, hands on traverse wheels, eyes at glass, shoulders set against recoil, learned that a longer barrel and a safer rack did not absolve judgment. They still read ground for edges, still asked artillery for a screen at the right bend, still trusted an infantryman's raised hand more than any map. But when a side plate flashed through smoke or a casemate showed too much steel at the turn, their first shot carried a different promise. German accounts, stripped of bravado by the winter of 1944-45, understood the implication. The battlefield they had prepared for, frontal duels held on ideal angles, was dissolving under a tempo they could not match. American tanks arrived sooner than expected from directions the last report had not warned about, and were steadier at the halt than memory allowed. The longer gun did not break physics at a panther's nose. It denied complacency once that nose had to turn. What had been contempt became caution, and caution multiplied across a campaign is a form of defeat. For American armor, the 76 mm became part of a grammar: blind, fix, angle, strike, an ordinary sentence written thousands of times across lanes, orchards, and frozen verges. Industry supplied verbs for that sentence: radios, wet stowage, HVSS, replacement parts on the right shelf. But it was crews who kept the rhythm. Their confidence was not theatrical. It was procedural. We can take the first minute. That confidence freed commanders to assume initiative at river shoulders and town approaches, to plan less around remedy from depth and more around answers already present at the point. History often tempts us toward absolutes: the better tank, the decisive gun. The 76 mm reminds us that technology is leverage, not destiny. It worked because a system, logistics, training, air, artillery, engineers, leadership, gave it the angles to matter. It left behind no mythology, only a cleaner arithmetic in the fights where time and geometry ruled. And in that arithmetic lies the quiet legacy: not invincibility, but a learned ability to turn seconds into outcomes, repeatedly until the war's balance tipped and stayed there.